Some people learn respect the hard way, others never get the chance to learn at all. Captain Morrison thought his rank meant everything, that his uniform gave him unlimited power over anyone beneath him. He was about to discover that some people earn their respect through blood, sweat, and battles most could never imagine surviving. When he pointed that service weapon at Lieutenant Sarah Chen that humid Tuesday morning, he had no idea he was threatening someone who had stared death in the face in the mountains of Afghanistan, who had saved entire villages from Taliban forces, and who had earned every scar on her body through acts of heroism that would never make it into any official report. What happened next would be talked about in military circles for decades. It would end one career and forever change how the Navy handled harassment and abuse of power. But most importantly, it would show what happens when someone mistakes quiet professionalism for weakness and uniform rank for actual strength. This is the true story of the day. A captain learned why you never ever test a Navy SEAL. Lieutenant Sarah Chen had been awake since 0400 hours, just like every other day for the past 15 years. The difference was that today marked her first week at Naval Station Norfolk, transitioning from active SEAL operations to what the brass called administrative duties. At 34, Sarah carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen the worst humanity could offer and lived to tell about it, though she rarely did tell about it. Her morning routine remained unchanged regardless of location. Physical training started before dawn, followed by a methodical review of intelligence reports, weather conditions, and personnel files. Even though her current assignment involved training new recruits rather than hunting terrorists in foreign mountains, Sarah approached each day with the same methodical precision that had kept her alive through 8 combat deployments. The Norfolk base buzzed with its usual morning activity as Sarah made her way to the administrative building. Sailors hurried between buildings, some clutching coffee cups like lifelines, others already deep in conversation about their daily assignments. The Virginia humidity hung thick in the air, a stark contrast to the dry heat of Afghanistan, where Sarah had spent most of the previous 3 years. Sarah's reputation had preceded her to Norfolk, though most of the stories were heavily classified. What people knew was that Lieutenant Chen had completed SEAL training in a class where she was one of only 2 women to even attempt the program, and the only one to graduate. What they didn't know were the details of Operation Nightfall, where she had single-handedly extracted a captured CIA operative from a Taliban stronghold, or Operation Silent Thunder, where her team had prevented a major terrorist attack on American forces by infiltrating an enemy camp and eliminating 12 insurgents without firing a single shot. The stories that did circulate were impressive enough. Sarah had been awarded the Silver Star, Bronze Star with Combat V, and Purple Heart, among others. Her fellow SEALs spoke of her with the kind of respect typically reserved for legends. But Sarah herself never talked about the wars, the missions, or the reasons behind her decorations. She simply did her job with a quiet intensity that made even the most seasoned military personnel take notice. Captain James Morrison was not one of those people who took notice of anything beyond his own reflection. At 48, Morrison had built his entire career on politics rather than performance. He had managed to avoid any real combat assignments through a combination of strategic transfers and well-placed connections. His idea of military leadership came from movies rather than experience, and he genuinely believed that the bars on his collar made him superior to everyone beneath him in rank. Morrison had been at Norfolk for 2 years, during which time he had developed a reputation for being difficult to work with. He had a particular problem with what he called uppity subordinates, anyone who didn't show him what he considered appropriate deference. Female personnel especially seemed to irritate him, though he was careful to keep his more offensive opinions to himself in official settings. When Morrison first heard about Lieutenant Chen's assignment to his command, his reaction was typical. He made several comments to his aide about another diversity hire and questioned whether someone who probably got special treatment belonged in his unit. The aide, a young ensign who had learned not to argue with the captain, simply nodded and took notes. Morrison had never served with special operations personnel. His understanding of SEALs came primarily from television and movies, and he genuinely believed that the reputation was mostly marketing hype designed to boost recruitment. In his mind, elite units were just regular soldiers with better public relations departments. This fundamental misunderstanding would prove to be his downfall. The first meeting between Sarah and Captain Morrison took place on a Tuesday morning in the main administrative building. Sarah had been scheduled to brief the captain on new training protocols she had been developing for combat readiness exercises. She arrived precisely on time, as always, carrying a detailed presentation and supporting documentation. Morrison kept her waiting for 23 minutes. This was a deliberate power play that he employed with most subordinates, but especially with those he felt needed to learn their place. When Sarah was finally called into his office, Morrison didn't look up from his desk for another full minute. "Lieutenant Chen, reporting as ordered, sir,"
Sarah announced in the standard military fashion.
Morrison slowly raised his eyes from the papers on his desk, making a show of looking Sarah up and down in a way that was clearly intended to be intimidating. What he saw was a compact woman of Chinese-American heritage, standing at attention with perfect military bearing. Her uniform was immaculate, her posture flawless, and her expression completely neutral. "So you're the hotshot SEAL everyone's been talking about," Morrison said, deliberately using a tone that suggested skepticism. "I have to admit, you're not quite what I expected." Sarah remained at attention. "Sir, I'm here to brief you on the new combat readiness protocols as requested."
Morrison leaned back in his chair, a gesture designed to project casual authority.
"Yes, well, before we get to that, I think we need to establish some ground rules. I run a tight ship here, Lieutenant. I don't care what kind of special treatment you might have gotten in your previous assignments. In my command, everyone follows the same rules and shows the same respect." "Understood, sir," Sarah replied without inflection. Morrison continued, warming to his theme. "I've heard all about these elite units and their supposed superiority, but at the end of the day, rank is rank, and I expect proper military courtesy from everyone under my command. That means when I give an order, you follow it without question. When I ask for something, you provide it immediately. And when I tell you to do something, you don't give me attitude or try to show off how tough you think you are." Sarah's expression never changed. "Sir, I understand the chain of command and have always followed proper military protocol." Morrison stood up and walked around his desk, positioning himself closer to Sarah than was appropriate for a professional interaction. "Good. I'm glad we understand each other. Now, I've been reviewing your file, and I have some concerns about whether someone with your background is really suited for the kind of administrative work we do here." This was Morrison's way of testing boundaries. He had used similar tactics with other personnel, particularly women, and had found that most people would become uncomfortable and defensive. He expected Sarah to either back down or become flustered, giving him additional psychological leverage. Instead, Sarah simply maintained her professional demeanor. "Sir, I'm prepared to perform any duties assigned to me to the best of my ability." Morrison interpreted this response as a challenge to his authority rather than professional compliance. His ego, already inflated by years of unchecked power, began to take over his judgment. "Lieutenant, I think you misunderstood me. This isn't a request. This is me telling you how things work in my command. And, right now, I'm getting the impression that you think you're something special." Sarah remained silent, which Morrison took as further defiance. The truth was that Sarah was conducting a rapid threat assessment, a skill that had been drilled into her through years of combat training.
She was noting Morrison's body language, his positioning, the layout of the office, and potential exit routes.
None of this was conscious thought. It was simply how her mind worked after years of staying alive in hostile environments. Morrison moved closer, now standing directly in front of Sarah and invading her personal space in a way that was clearly intended to intimidate. "I asked you a question, Lieutenant. Do you think you're something special?" "No, sir," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm here to do my job." Morrison's face began to redden. In his mind, Sarah's calm responses were a form of disrespect. He had expected her to show fear, or at least discomfort, at his aggressive posturing, but instead she seemed completely unaffected by his attempts at intimidation. This was not how his power games usually played out. "You know what, Lieutenant? I think you need an attitude adjustment. I think you've been told your hot stuff for so long that you've forgotten what military discipline actually means." Morrison reached for his sidearm, a Beretta M9 that he wore as part of his daily uniform, despite having no legitimate reason to carry it in an administrative setting. His intent was to use the weapon as a prop to reinforce his authority, similar to how he might slam his hand on a desk or raise his voice. In Morrison's mind, this was just another intimidation tactic, but as soon as Morrison's hand moved toward his weapon, everything changed. Sarah's body reacted before her mind had fully processed the threat. Years of combat training and survival instincts took over in a fraction of a second. She shifted her weight slightly, adjusting her stance to provide better mobility while maintaining the appearance of standing at attention. Her breathing deepened almost imperceptibly, and her muscles tensed in preparation for action. Morrison, completely oblivious to these subtle changes, continued with his performance. He slowly drew the pistol from its holster, making sure Sarah could see every movement. His plan was to hold the weapon casually, maybe pointed in her general direction, and watch her break down under the psychological pressure. "Maybe this will help you understand the gravity of the situation," Morrison said, his voice taking on what he thought was a menacing tone. "In case you haven't figured it out yet, Lieutenant, I have the power to make your life very difficult. Your fancy SEAL reputation doesn't mean anything here." Sarah's eyes tracked the movement of the weapon with the cold precision of someone who had spent years in life-or-death situations. She was calculating distances, angles, and timing. Morrison was holding the pistol incorrectly, his finger near but not on the trigger, his stance unbalanced. He was close enough that she could disarm him in less than 2 seconds, but she remained motionless, waiting to see how far he would take this. Morrison raised the pistol, pointing it directly at Sarah's chest from a distance of approximately 3 feet. In his mind, this was the moment when she would finally break, when she would show him the fear and respect he felt he deserved. He expected her to step backward, to plead, to acknowledge his superior position. Instead, Sarah Chen looked him directly in the eyes with an expression of complete calm. Morrison had just made the biggest mistake of his life, but he wouldn't understand that until it was far too late to take it back. He had drawn a weapon on someone who had survived firefights with Taliban insurgents, who had killed enemy combatants with her bare hands, and who had been trained to respond to threats with immediate and overwhelming force. The only reason Sarah hadn't already disarmed him was that she was still processing the surreal nature of the situation. In all her years of military service, through all the combat deployments and dangerous missions, she had never had a superior officer draw a weapon on her in what was supposed to be a routine administrative meeting. But as Morrison continued to point the pistol at her, Sarah began to understand that this wasn't just poor judgment or an intimidation tactic gone too far. This was a fundamental abuse of power by someone who had no understanding of what he was actually doing. "Sir," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying a note that Morrison completely failed to recognize as warning, "I respectfully suggest you holster your weapon." Morrison interpreted this as fear, which only encouraged him further. "I don't think you're in any position to make suggestions, Lieutenant. I think it's time you learn some respect." Those would be the last words Captain Morrison spoke before his world changed forever. What happened next took exactly 1.8 seconds. Sarah Chen moved with the fluid precision of someone whose body had been trained to react faster than conscious thought could process. Her left hand swept upward in a perfect arc, striking Morrison's wrist at the exact pressure point that would cause his grip to involuntarily release. Her right hand simultaneously grabbed the barrel of the pistol, twisting it away from her body while her left foot stepped forward and swept Morrison's legs out from under him. Morrison found himself flat on his back on the office floor, with Sarah standing over him, his own pistol now pointed directly at his forehead. The entire sequence had been so fast that his brain was still processing the beginning of the movement when it was already over. He blinked in confusion, trying to understand how he had gone from being in control of the situation to being completely helpless in less than 2 seconds. Sarah's voice was calm and professional, but there was something in her tone that Morrison had never heard before. It was the voice of someone who had given final warnings to enemy combatants in dark Afghan valleys, someone who had looked into the eyes of men who wanted to kill her and calmly explained their last chance to surrender. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said quietly, the barrel of the pistol steady and unwavering. "You have just committed assault with a deadly weapon against a fellow service member."
You drew your weapon on an unarmed subordinate during what was supposed to be a routine administrative meeting.
"This is a court-martial offense that will end your career and likely result in significant prison time." Morrison tried to speak but found that his mouth had gone completely dry. The confidence and authority he had felt just moments before had evaporated entirely, replaced by a growing understanding of just how badly he had miscalculated the situation. Sarah continued, her voice never rising above a conversational tone. "I'm going to give you exactly one opportunity to explain your actions before I notify base security, the military police, and your commanding officer about what just occurred in this room." Morrison finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a croak. "Lieutenant, I was just trying to—" "You were just trying to what, Captain?" Sarah asked. The weapon still pointed at his forehead with rock-steady precision. "You drew a loaded weapon on an unarmed subordinate. In combat zones, that would be considered a hostile action worthy of immediate neutralization. So I'm very interested to hear your explanation for why you felt it was appropriate to threaten my life during a briefing about training protocols." Morrison's mind raced as he tried to find some way to salvage the situation. His first instinct was to fall back on his rank and authority, but even in his current state of panic, He could see that this approach was not going to work. The woman standing over him was not the intimidated subordinate he had expected to create. She was something else entirely. "I wasn't going to hurt you," Morrison said, his voice shaking. I was just trying to make a point about authority and respect." Sarah's expression never changed. "Captain, you pointed a loaded weapon at my chest from 3 feet away. In military protocol, that constitutes a direct threat of lethal force. The only reason you are still breathing is that I chose to disarm you, rather than neutralize the threat permanently." The word neutralize sent a chill down Morrison's spine. He was beginning to understand that the calm, professional woman standing over him was not speaking theoretically. She was explaining what had almost happened to him and why he was lucky to still be alive. Sarah continued her explanation in the same matter-of-fact tone. "Captain, I have been in 47 firefights during my career. I have been shot at by enemy combatants exactly 231 times. I have personally neutralized hostile targets who posed threats to my team and mission objectives. In every single one of those situations, the threat was more legitimate than what you just did to me." Morrison was beginning to hyperventilate as the full weight of his actions began to sink in. He had drawn a weapon on someone who had killed enemy soldiers for a living, someone who had been trained to respond to threats with immediate and overwhelming violence. The only reason he wasn't dead was that she had chosen not to kill him. "Please," Morrison gasped, "just put the gun down." "We can work this out. I made a mistake." Sarah considered this request for several seconds. "Captain, you're asking me to trust that someone who just drew a weapon on me during a routine meeting can be trusted not to do it again. Given your demonstrated decision-making process, why should I believe that you won't simply reach for another weapon as soon as I'm no longer pointing this one at you?" Morrison had no answer for this question because there was no good answer. He had acted impulsively and aggressively, and now he was facing the consequences of threatening someone who was exponentially more dangerous than he had realized. Sarah made her decision. With the same fluid motion she had used to disarm Morrison, she ejected the magazine from the pistol, cleared the chamber, and set both the weapon and ammunition on Morrison's desk, well out of his reach. Morrison remained on the floor, afraid to move without permission. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said, her voice returning to standard military formality, "I am going to walk out of this office and report this incident to base security, the military police, and your commanding officer. I suggest you use the next few minutes to consider how you want to explain your actions." Morrison struggled to his feet, his legs shaky and his uniform disheveled. "Lieutenant, wait. Please. Can't we handle this between ourselves? I understand I made an error in judgment, but surely we can resolve this without involving outside parties." Sarah paused at the door and turned back to face him. "Captain, you drew a weapon on a subordinate in an attempt to intimidate them into submission. This is not an error in judgment. This is criminal assault and a serious violation of military law. There is no scenario in which this incident gets handled quietly." Morrison's mind was racing through all the possible consequences of Sarah's report. A court-martial would not only end his career, it would result in criminal charges, imprisonment, and the loss of his pension and benefits. Everything he had worked for over the past 20 years would be destroyed. "Lieutenant Chen," Morrison said, his voice taking on a desperate tone, "I understand you're angry, and you have every right to be. But please consider the broader implications here. I have a family, children who depend on me, my career, my entire life. Surely there's some way we can resolve this that doesn't destroy everything." Sarah stopped and looked at Morrison with an expression he couldn't quite read. For a moment, he thought he might have reached her, that an appeal to mercy might save him from the consequences of his actions. "Captain Morrison," Sarah said quietly, 3 years ago, I was part of a team that raided a Taliban compound in Afghanistan. We were looking for a high-value target who had been responsible for several attacks on American forces. When we breached the building, we found 12 enemy combatants who immediately opened fire on my team." Morrison listened, not understanding where this story was going, but hoping it might somehow lead to his salvation. Sarah continued, "During the firefight, one of the Taliban fighters threw down his weapon and surrendered. My team had taken casualties. I was bleeding from shrapnel wounds. I was angry, and I had every justification under the rules of engagement to consider him a continued threat." Morrison held his breath. "But I didn't kill him," Sarah said, "because that's not what professional soldiers do. We follow the law, we follow proper procedures, and we don't abuse our power just because we're angry or because we can get away with it." Sarah paused, letting this sink in before delivering her final judgment. "You, Captain Morrison, drew a weapon on an unarmed subordinate who was trying to brief you on training protocols. You did this not in combat, not under stress, not because of any legitimate threat, but because you wanted to intimidate someone you thought wouldn't fight back. You abused your authority and violated your oath as an officer." Morrison opened his mouth to respond, but Sarah held up a hand to stop him. "I showed mercy to an enemy combatant who had been trying to kill me and my teammates. You don't get the same consideration, because you should have known better. You are supposed to be a leader, an officer, someone who sets an example for junior personnel. Instead, you chose to use your rank and access to weapons to threaten someone you perceived as vulnerable." Sarah opened the office door and prepared to leave. "The difference between that Taliban fighter and you, Captain Morrison, is that he was at least honest about being an enemy." Morrison watched helplessly as Sarah walked out of his office, knowing that his career and his life were about to change forever. He had gone from thinking he was teaching a lesson to realizing that he had just received one, and the cost was going to be everything he had spent his entire adult life building. But Sarah's work was just beginning. What Morrison didn't know was that his actions had not occurred in a vacuum. Sarah had been quietly documenting a pattern of inappropriate behavior and abuse of authority that extended far beyond this single incident. Morrison had chosen to threaten the one person on base who had both the skills to handle his aggression and the evidence to destroy his career. As Sarah walked down the corridor toward base security, she was already mentally preparing the detailed report that would not only end Morrison's military career, but potentially prevent him from ever being in a position to threaten anyone else. She had learned long ago that some battles are won not with weapons, but with paperwork, procedure, and the patient gathering of evidence. Morrison had thought he was dealing with just another subordinate he could bully into submission. Instead, he had threatened someone who fought wars for a living, someone who had spent years learning how to eliminate threats, both immediate and long-term. The captain was about to learn that the most dangerous battles are often the ones you don't see coming. Sarah Chen walked directly to the base security office with the same purposeful stride she had used when approaching enemy positions in Afghanistan. Her mind was already organizing the sequence of events, preparing the detailed timeline that would be required for the formal report. Years of writing after-action reports had taught her the importance of precise documentation, especially when the stakes were high. Master Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez looked up as Sarah entered the security office. Rodriguez was a 23-year veteran who had seen enough military politics to recognize serious trouble when it walked through his door. The expression on Lieutenant Chen's face told him this wasn't a routine visit. "Master Chief," Sarah said, her voice carrying the crisp formality that indicated official business, "I need to report an incident involving assault with a deadly weapon by a superior officer." Rodriguez immediately sat up straighter. In his 2 decades of military service, accusations of assault between officers were extremely rare, and accusations involving weapons were almost unheard of outside of combat zones. "Lieutenant, please have a seat. I'm going to record this conversation, and I'll need a detailed statement." Sarah provided a complete account of the incident, speaking in the clear, objective tone she had learnt during her intelligence briefings. She included every detail from the moment she entered Morrison's office until the moment she left, paying particular attention to Morrison's exact words and actions. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes, but mostly just recording the statement for later review. "Lieutenant Chen," Rodriguez said when Sarah finished her account, "this is obviously a very serious allegation. I'm going to need to notify the military police, the base commander, and the Inspector General's office immediately. I'm also going to need to secure Captain Morrison's office and confiscate his weapon pending investigation." Sarah nodded. "Master Chief, there's something else you should know. This incident didn't occur in isolation. Captain Morrison has been displaying a pattern of inappropriate behavior toward female personnel since his assignment to this base." Rodriguez raised an eyebrow. "Do you have documentation of these incidents?" Sarah reached into a briefcase and produced a thick folder. "I've been quietly gathering statements and incident reports for the past 6 months. Multiple female personnel have reported inappropriate comments, unwanted physical contact, and abuse of authority by Captain Morrison. Most of these incidents were never formally reported because the victims were afraid of retaliation." Rodriguez opened the folder and began scanning the contents. What he saw made his expression grow increasingly grim. There were detailed statements from 8 different women, ranging in rank from seaman recruit to lieutenant commander. The accusations included inappropriate sexual comments, deliberate assignment of humiliating duties, threats of negative fitness reports for those who complained, and in 2 cases, unwanted physical contact. "Lieutenant," Rodriguez said slowly, "why wasn't this brought to my attention earlier?" Sarah's expression remained neutral, but there was steel in her voice. Master Chief, with respect, several of these women did attempt to report incidents through proper channels. In each case, they were told that there wasn't sufficient evidence, or that Captain Morrison's version of events was more credible, or that they needed to develop thicker skin for military service. Rodriguez winced. He was beginning to understand that the incident in Morrison's office was not just about one captain making a serious error in judgment. It was about a systemic failure to address a pattern of abuse that had been building for months. Sarah continued, I began documenting these incidents because I recognized the pattern from previous assignments. Captain Morrison is a predator who uses his rank to target people he perceives as vulnerable. Today, he made the mistake of targeting someone who was prepared to fight back. Rodriguez nodded grimly. Lieutenant, I appreciate your thoroughness in documenting these incidents. This information will be crucial for the investigation. He paused, then added, Can I ask why you chose to compile this evidence rather than going directly to the Inspector General? Sarah considered the question carefully. Master Chief, I learned a long time ago that accusations without solid evidence rarely succeed against senior officers. Captain Morrison has political connections and a clean official record. If I had made accusations based solely on hearsay and isolated incidents, he would have weathered the investigation and then retaliated against everyone involved. Rodriguez was beginning to understand that Lieutenant Chen had been conducting a military operation, patiently gathering intelligence and waiting for the right moment to strike. Morrison's decision to draw a weapon on her had provided the dramatic, undeniable incident that would make all the other accusations impossible to ignore. But today, Sarah continued, Captain Morrison committed assault with a deadly weapon in front of a witness who cannot be intimidated, discredited, or silenced. This incident will force a thorough investigation that will uncover all the other abuses he has committed. Rodriguez felt a grudging admiration for the young lieutenant's tactical thinking. She had recognized a threat to military personnel and had systematically built a case to neutralize it. It was exactly the kind of strategic patience that special operations personnel were trained to employ. 20 minutes later, Base Commander Captain Patricia Hendricks received the phone call that would dominate the rest of her week. Rodriguez provided a brief overview of the situation, emphasizing the seriousness of the accusations and the need for immediate action. Captain Hendricks had been in command at Norfolk for 3 years and had built a reputation as someone who took personnel issues seriously. Master Chief, Captain Hendricks said, I want Captain Morrison confined to quarters pending investigation. I want his office sealed and all his weapons secured. I want the military police to take formal statements from all parties involved, and I want a preliminary report on my desk within 6 hours. Rodriguez acknowledged the orders and immediately began implementing them. Within 30 minutes, military police had arrived at Morrison's office to find him sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the wall. He offered no resistance when they informed him that he was being confined pending investigation, though his face went completely white when they formally read him his rights. Meanwhile, Sarah was providing a second, more detailed statement to the military police investigators. She answered every question with the same calm precision she had shown during Morrison's interrogation, providing exact times, specific quotes, and detailed descriptions of Morrison's actions and demeanor. Detective Sergeant Walsh, the lead MP investigator, had been expecting to interview a shaken victim of assault. Instead, she found herself talking to someone who spoke about the incident with the clinical detachment of a professional observer. Lieutenant Chen's statement was more detailed and organized than most police reports Walsh had seen from trained investigators. Lieutenant Chen, Walsh said when the formal statement was complete, I have to ask, you obviously have significant combat training. Why didn't you simply disarm Captain Morrison and detain him until military police arrived? Sarah considered the question. Sergeant Walsh, Captain Morrison made a serious error in judgment, but I didn't perceive him as an ongoing threat once I had control of the situation. My objective was to end the immediate threat and report the incident through proper channels, not to escalate the situation unnecessarily. Walsh nodded, making notes. You mentioned that you have documentation regarding other incidents involving Captain Morrison. Are you prepared to provide that evidence to this investigation? Sarah handed over copies of the folder she had previously shown to Master Chief Rodriguez. Sergeant, I believe these incidents are directly relevant to Captain Morrison's pattern of behavior and his decision to draw a weapon when he felt his authority was being challenged. Walsh opened the folder and quickly realized that she was looking at evidence of a much larger investigation than she had initially anticipated. The documentation was thorough, professional, and damning. It painted a picture of an officer who had been systematically abusing his authority for months while the normal reporting channels had failed to address the problem. As Walsh reviewed the evidence, she began to understand that Lieutenant Chen had essentially conducted a counterintelligence operation against a fellow officer. She had identified a threat, gathered evidence, and waited for the opportunity to neutralize it with maximum effectiveness. "Lieutenant," Walsh said slowly, "this is incredibly detailed documentation. How long have you been gathering this information?" Sarah's expression remained neutral. "Sergeant, when I first arrived at Norfolk, I began hearing complaints from female personnel about Captain Morrison's behavior. As someone with experience in intelligence gathering, I recognized the importance of documentation in building a solid case." Walsh was impressed by the lieutenant's methodical approach, but also somewhat concerned by the implications. "Lieutenant Chen, were you planning to use this information to take action against Captain Morrison?" Sarah shook her head. "Sergeant, my intent was to provide documented evidence to support any future complaints that might be filed against Captain Morrison. I had hoped that someone would file a formal complaint that would trigger an investigation where this evidence would be useful." Walsh understood. Lieutenant Chen had been preparing for a battle she hoped wouldn't be necessary, but when Morrison forced the confrontation, she had been ready with overwhelming evidence. "What I didn't anticipate," Sarah continued, "was that Captain Morrison would escalate to threatening me with a weapon. That action forced me to bring this matter forward immediately, rather than waiting for someone else to file a complaint." Walsh closed the folder and looked directly at Sarah. "Lieutenant, I want to make sure I understand the sequence of events clearly. You went to Captain Morrison's office for a routine briefing. Without provocation, he became aggressive, drew his weapon, and pointed it at you. You disarmed him, secured the weapon, and immediately reported the incident. Is that accurate?"
"That is correct, Sergeant."
Walsh made a final note in her report. "Lieutenant Chen, I want you to know that this investigation will be thorough and complete. The evidence you've provided will ensure that all relevant incidents are properly examined." Sarah nodded. "Sergeant Walsh, I appreciate the professionalism you and your team have shown in handling this matter. I understand that investigations involving senior officers can be politically sensitive." Walsh smiled grimly. "Lieutenant, with the evidence you've provided, the political considerations are pretty much irrelevant. This is going to be a straightforward case with a very predictable outcome." As Sarah left the military police office, she reflected on the events of the morning. In her years of combat operations, she had learned that the most important victories were often the quietest ones. Taking down a terrorist cell might save lives in the immediate term, but removing a predator from a position of authority could protect people for years to come. Captain Morrison had thought he was teaching her a lesson about military hierarchy and respect. Instead, he had walked directly into a trap that had been months in the making. The difference was that Morrison had been motivated by ego and the desire to intimidate, while Sarah had been motivated by the desire to protect her fellow service members from future abuse. By the time Sarah returned to her quarters that evening, word of Morrison's arrest had spread throughout the base. The official story was simply that Captain Morrison was under investigation for violations of military regulations. But in the tight-knit military community, rumors traveled fast. What most people didn't know was that Lieutenant Chen had just executed one of the most effective non-violent neutralizations of an abusive officer in recent Navy history. Morrison's career was over, his reputation was destroyed, and his ability to hurt other people had been permanently ended. And she had done it all by simply being prepared, staying professional, and allowing Morrison to defeat himself through his own poor judgment and criminal behavior. The court-martial of Captain James Morrison began exactly 47 days after the incident in his office. During those 7 weeks, the investigation had expanded far beyond what anyone had initially anticipated. What had started as a case of assault with a deadly weapon had evolved into a comprehensive examination of systemic failures in command structure, reporting procedures, and officer accountability. Lieutenant Colonel Amanda Foster had been brought in from JAG headquarters to prosecute the case. Foster was a former Marine with 15 years of military legal experience and a reputation for thorough preparation. When she first reviewed the evidence against Morrison, she realized this was not just a criminal case, but an opportunity to send a message about standards of conduct throughout the Navy. The evidence was overwhelming. In addition to Sarah's detailed testimony about the weapon incident, the investigation had uncovered statements from 14 female personnel who had experienced inappropriate behavior from Morrison. The pattern was clear and consistent. Morrison would identify female personnel he perceived as vulnerable or unlikely to report incidents, then gradually escalate his inappropriate behavior until he was essentially using his rank to create a hostile work environment. What made the case particularly damaging was the documentation Sarah had compiled. Her systematic approach to gathering evidence had created an unassailable record of Morrison's behavior over time. Phone records showed that several women had attempted to report incidents to their chain of command, only to be discouraged or dismissed. Email records revealed Morrison making inappropriate comments about female personnel to other officers. Duty assignment records showed Morrison deliberately assigning humiliating or excessive duties to women who had rebuffed his advances. Morrison's defense attorney, Lieutenant Commander Stevens, faced an impossible task. The weapon incident was captured on security cameras in the hallway outside Morrison's office, showing Sarah entering the room calmly and exiting minutes later to report to base security. Morrison's own statement to investigators had been rambling and contradictory, alternating between claiming the incident was a misunderstanding and blaming Sarah for provoking him. Stevens had attempted to build a defense around Morrison's military record and his lack of previous formal disciplinary action. However, this strategy collapsed when Foster demonstrated that Morrison's clean record was the result of systematic failures to properly investigate and document his inappropriate behavior, not evidence of good conduct. The courtroom was packed for the opening statements. Word had spread throughout the military community that this case would set important precedents for how the Navy handled harassment and abuse of authority cases. Base Commander Captain Hendricks had made it clear that the entire chain of command was taking the case seriously. Lieutenant Colonel Foster began her opening statement by addressing the fundamental question of military leadership and trust. "Ladies and gentlemen of the court," Foster said, "this case is about what happens when someone entrusted with authority chooses to abuse that trust for personal gratification. Captain Morrison was given command responsibility over junior personnel, and he systematically used that authority to intimidate, harass, and ultimately threaten those personnel." Foster walked the court through Morrison's pattern of behavior, using the evidence Sarah had compiled to demonstrate how Morrison had escalated from inappropriate comments to deliberate humiliation to physical intimidation. She emphasized that the weapon incident was not an isolated error in judgment, but the predictable culmination of months of unchecked abuse. "The evidence will show that Captain Morrison drew his service weapon and pointed it directly at Lieutenant Chen because she refused to be intimidated by his previous tactics," Foster continued. "When his usual methods of control failed, he escalated to the threat of lethal force against an unarmed subordinate who was simply trying to brief him on training protocols." Foster then addressed what she knew would be the defense's main argument about Morrison's previous record. "The defense will argue that Captain Morrison's lack of previous formal disciplinary action indicates this was an aberration in an otherwise exemplary career. The evidence will show that Captain Morrison's clean record was maintained through a systematic failure of reporting and accountability systems, not through exemplary conduct." Lieutenant Commander Stevens faced the difficult task of defending the indefensible. His opening statement focused on Morrison's 20-year career, his family circumstances, and his claim that the weapon incident was a misunderstanding that had been blown out of proportion. "Captain Morrison made an error in judgment," Stevens argued. "He drew his weapon not as a threat, but as a misguided attempt to emphasize the importance of military discipline. He never intended to harm Lieutenant Chen, and he poses no ongoing threat to military personnel." Stevens attempted to portray Sarah as someone who had overreacted to what should have been handled as a minor disciplinary matter. This approach would prove to be a serious tactical error. When Sarah took the stand, she provided her testimony with the same calm professionalism she had shown throughout the investigation. She answered every question directly and completely, never showing emotion or defensiveness, even when Stevens attempted aggressive cross-examination. Foster's direct examination of Sarah was methodical and devastating. Sarah walked through the incident step by step, explaining Morrison's escalating aggressive behavior and his ultimate decision to draw and point his weapon. She described her own response in clinical terms, emphasizing that her training had given her the ability to disarm Morrison without injuring him, despite the serious nature of the threat. "Lieutenant Chen," Foster asked, "in your professional opinion, as someone with extensive combat experience, how would you characterize Captain Morrison's actions when he drew his weapon and pointed it at you?" Sarah's answer was delivered in the same tone she might use to brief superiors on enemy movements. "Ma'am, in military terms, pointing a weapon at another person constitutes presentation of lethal force. In combat situations, such actions would be considered hostile and would justify immediate neutralization of the threat." Foster continued, "Lieutenant Chen, why did you choose to disarm Captain Morrison rather than using more aggressive defensive measures?" Sarah considered the question carefully before responding. "Ma'am, despite Captain Morrison's threatening actions, I assessed that he was not a trained combatant and that the situation could be controlled without causing him permanent harm. My objective was to neutralize the immediate threat and report the incident through proper channels." Stevens' cross-examination attempted to portray Sarah as someone who had used excessive force in responding to what he characterized as Morrison's poor judgment. This approach backfired spectacularly. "Lieutenant Chen, Stevens asked, "Isn't it true that you used your specialized combat training to assault a superior officer?" Sarah's response was devastating in its simplicity. "Sir, I used my training to defend myself when a superior officer pointed a loaded weapon at me. The alternative would have been to allow myself to be threatened with lethal force by someone who was clearly not in control of his actions." Stevens pressed on, apparently not realizing how badly this line of questioning was playing with the court. "But you could have simply stepped back or tried to de-escalate the situation verbally, couldn't you?" Sarah's answer highlighted just how dangerous Morrison's actions had been. "Sir, when someone points a weapon at you from 3 feet away, stepping back is not a viable defensive option. Verbal de-escalation is not effective when the aggressor has already escalated to the threat of lethal force." The cross-examination continued for 2 hours, with Stevens attempting to find some inconsistency in Sarah's account or some indication that she had overreacted to Morrison's behavior. Instead, his questioning only served to emphasize Sarah's professionalism, her restraint in the face of a serious threat, and the systematic nature of Morrison's inappropriate conduct. When Foster called the other female personnel who had experienced Morrison's harassment, the testimony painted a picture of an officer who had been operating with impunity for months. The women described a pattern of behavior that started with inappropriate comments and gradually escalated to deliberate humiliation and abuse of authority. Petty Officer Second Class Martinez testified that Morrison had assigned her to clean the men's bathroom for a week, after she had declined his invitation to dinner. Ensign Thompson described how Morrison had made sexually explicit comments about her appearance during official meetings. Lieutenant J.G. Williams explained how Morrison had given her consistently negative performance evaluations despite her excellent work record, apparently in retaliation for her refusal to socialize with him outside of work. Each testimony followed the same pattern. Morrison would target women he perceived as vulnerable, gradually escalate his inappropriate behavior, and use his authority to retaliate against those who resisted or complained. The systematic nature of his conduct made it clear that the weapon incident was not an isolated error in judgment, but the predictable result of an escalating pattern of abuse. The most damaging testimony came from Master Chief Rodriguez, who admitted that several women had attempted to report Morrison's behavior through proper channels, only to be discouraged from filing formal complaints. Rodriguez testified that he had personally advised 3 different women that their complaints were unlikely to be successful and might result in retaliation against them. "Master Chief," Foster asked, "why did you discourage these women from filing formal complaints against Captain Morrison?" Rodriguez looked uncomfortable but answered honestly, "Ma'am, based on my experience, complaints against senior officers are very difficult to prove, and personnel who file unsuccessful complaints often face retaliation. I thought I was protecting these women by advising them to handle the situations informally." Foster pressed further. "Master Chief, did it occur to you that by discouraging formal complaints, you might be enabling Captain Morrison to continue his inappropriate behavior?" Rodriguez's answer was painful to hear. "Ma'am, in hindsight, I realized that my advice may have contributed to the problem. I was trying to protect individual personnel without considering the broader implications for unit integrity and safety." This testimony highlighted one of the most important aspects of the case. Morrison's behavior had been enabled by a system that prioritized avoiding conflict over protecting personnel. The institutional failure to address harassment complaints had allowed Morrison's behavior to escalate, to the point where he felt comfortable drawing a weapon on a subordinate. By the end of the prosecution's case, Morrison's guilt was beyond question. The evidence was overwhelming, the testimony was consistent, and the pattern of behavior was clear. Stevens faced the impossible task of defending a client who had committed assault with a deadly weapon as the culmination of months of systematic harassment. Morrison himself had chosen not to testify, on advice of counsel. Stevens knew that putting Morrison on the stand would only provide Foster with additional opportunities to highlight his client's poor judgment and inappropriate behavior. The defense's entire case consisted of character witnesses who testified about Morrison's previous military service and his family circumstances. These witnesses painted a picture of someone who had served honorably for most of his career and who had made an error in judgment that should not define his entire life. However, Foster's cross-examination of these character witnesses revealed that none of them had been aware of Morrison's pattern of harassment. Their positive opinions were based on limited interactions that did not reflect Morrison's true character or conduct. As the trial neared its conclusion, it became clear that the real significance of the case extended far beyond Morrison's individual fate. The testimony had exposed systematic failures in reporting procedures, accountability measures, and command oversight that had enabled an abusive officer to operate with impunity for months. Captain Morrison had thought he was dealing with just another subordinate he could intimidate into submission. Instead, he had threatened someone who possessed both the skills to defend herself and the strategic thinking to build an unassailable case against him. The result would be not just the end of his career, but a fundamental change in how the Navy handled harassment and abuse of authority cases. The court was about to deliver a verdict that would reverberate throughout the military justice system for years to come. The court deliberated for exactly 4 hours and 37 minutes. When the panel returned to the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Morrison sat at the defense table, his face pale, and drawn from weeks of knowing that his career and his freedom hung in the balance. Sarah sat in the gallery, maintaining the same professional composure she had displayed throughout the trial. Colonel Patricia Hawkins, the senior member of the court-martial panel, stood to deliver the verdict. Her voice was clear and unwavering as she addressed the court. In the matter of the United States versus Captain James Morrison, on the charge of assault with a deadly weapon, the court finds the defendant guilty. Morrison's shoulders sagged as the weight of the verdict hit him. Lieutenant Commander Stevens placed a steadying hand on his client's arm, but there was nothing more he could do. Colonel Hawkins continued, "On the charge of conduct unbecoming an officer, the court finds the defendant guilty. On the charge of abuse of authority, the court finds the defendant guilty." The guilty verdicts on all charges meant that Morrison would face not only dismissal from the Navy, but significant prison time. The systematic nature of his conduct and the serious escalation to weapon threats had made a lenient sentence impossible. During the sentencing phase, Lieutenant Colonel Foster presented evidence about the broader impact of Morrison's actions on unit cohesion, military discipline, and the safety of female personnel. She argued that Morrison's behavior had created a hostile environment that undermined the Navy's core values and mission effectiveness. "Your Honor," Foster addressed the court, "Captain Morrison's actions represent a fundamental betrayal of the trust placed in military officers. His systematic harassment of female personnel and his ultimate escalation to threatening a subordinate with a deadly weapon cannot be dismissed as isolated errors in judgment." Foster continued, "The evidence shows that Captain Morrison's behavior created an environment where female personnel felt unsafe and unable to perform their duties effectively. His actions undermined military discipline, unit cohesion, and the Navy's commitment to equal treatment of all personnel. The prosecution requested the maximum sentence allowed under military law: dismissal from service, forfeiture of all pay and benefits, and confinement for 5 years. Lieutenant Commander Stevens made a final plea for leniency, emphasizing Morrison's family circumstances and his previous 20 years of military service. However, even Stevens seemed to understand that his client's actions had crossed lines that made mercy inappropriate. "Your Honor," Stevens argued, "while Captain Morrison's actions were inexcusable, I ask the court to consider that this represents an aberration in an otherwise distinguished career. Captain Morrison has served his country for 2 decades and has a family who depends on him." Colonel Hawkins announced that the court would reconvene the following morning for sentencing. That night, Morrison would spend his final evening as a military officer, contemplating the complete destruction of everything he had spent his adult life building. The next morning, Colonel Hawkins delivered a sentence that would be discussed in military legal circles for years to come. "Captain Morrison," Hawkins announced, "you have been found guilty of serious violations of military law that strike at the heart of military discipline and unit integrity. Your systematic harassment of female personnel and your escalation to threatening a subordinate with a deadly weapon represent conduct that cannot be tolerated in any military organization." Morrison stood at attention as Hawkins continued, "The court sentences you to dismissal from the Navy, forfeiture of all pay and allowances, and confinement for 4 years. Additionally, this court recommends that the Department of Defense implement comprehensive reforms to reporting procedures and accountability measures to prevent similar incidents in the future." Morrison's dismissal from the Navy meant the loss of his pension, his benefits, and his military rank. He would serve 4 years in military prison, after which he would be released as a civilian with a federal conviction on his record. His security clearance would be permanently revoked, making employment in defense-related industries impossible. As the court proceedings concluded, Sarah Chen reflected on the broader implications of what had occurred. Morrison's conviction represented more than just justice for his victims. It demonstrated that the military justice system could work when provided with adequate evidence and proper investigation. In the weeks following the court-martial, the ripple effects of Morrison's case began to be felt throughout the Navy. Base Commander Captain Hendricks implemented new reporting procedures that made it easier for personnel to file complaints about harassment and abuse of authority. Master Chief Rodriguez was reassigned and required to complete additional training on handling harassment complaints. The Inspector General's office launched a comprehensive review of similar cases throughout the Navy, leading to the identification of several other instances where reporting procedures had failed to address inappropriate conduct by senior officers. Morrison's case became a catalyst for systemic reforms that would protect future personnel from similar abuse. For Sarah Chen, the case represented the successful completion of an operation that had taken months of careful planning and patient evidence gathering. Her systematic approach to documenting Morrison's behavior had made his conviction inevitable once he escalated to criminal assault. 3 months after Morrison's sentencing, Sarah was transferred to a new assignment with Naval Special Warfare Command. Her performance during the Morrison case had caught the attention of senior leadership, who recognized her value not just as a combat operator, but as someone capable of addressing complex personnel and security issues. Before leaving Norfolk, Sarah received letters from 8 different women thanking her for taking action against Morrison. Several mentioned that they had been considering leaving military service rather than continuing to endure Morrison's harassment. Her willingness to confront the problem had not only ended Morrison's abuse, but had restored their faith in military justice and leadership. Petty Officer Martinez, one of Morrison's victims, wrote, "Lieutenant Chen, I want you to know that your courage in standing up to Captain Morrison changed my life. I was planning to leave the Navy because I couldn't handle his treatment anymore. Now I'm staying, and I'm not afraid anymore. Thank you for showing me that the system can work when good people are willing to fight for what's right." The broader military community took notice of how the Morrison case had been handled. The thorough investigation, the comprehensive prosecution, and the serious sentence sent a clear message that harassment and abuse of authority would not be tolerated, regardless of the perpetrator's rank or connections. Lieutenant Colonel Foster, who had prosecuted the case, was promoted to colonel and assigned to develop new training programs for military legal officers on handling harassment and assault cases. The Morrison case became a standard case study in military justice courses, demonstrating how systematic evidence gathering and proper investigation could overcome the institutional barriers that had historically protected abusive officers. Morrison himself served his full 4-year sentence in military prison. During his incarceration, he participated in counseling programs and eventually came to understand the serious harm his behavior had caused. Upon his release, he struggled to find employment due to his conviction and dismissal from military service. The comfortable retirement he had planned was replaced by a difficult transition to civilian life with limited prospects and a damaged reputation. The contrast between Morrison's fate and Sarah's career trajectory was stark. While Morrison's life was defined by the consequences of his abusive behavior, Sarah continued to serve with distinction, eventually being promoted to lieutenant commander and taking on increasingly important responsibilities in naval special warfare. 5 years after the incident, Sarah was asked to speak at a military leadership conference about the Morrison case. Her presentation focused on the importance of institutional accountability and the responsibility of all personnel to protect their fellow service members from abuse. The Morrison case demonstrated that abuse of authority thrives in environments where reporting is discouraged, where victims are not believed, and where institutional loyalty is prioritized over individual safety. Sarah told the audience of senior military leaders, "Our responsibility as leaders is to create environments where people feel safe to report inappropriate behavior, where complaints are investigated thoroughly and fairly, and where the consequences for abuse of authority are swift and decisive." Sarah's presentation concluded with a message that had guided her actions throughout the Morrison case. Military leadership is not about using authority to intimidate or control others. It's about using that authority to protect and serve the people under your command. When we fail to live up to that standard, we betray the trust that makes military service possible. The Morrison case became a turning point in how the Navy addressed harassment and abuse of authority. The systematic failures that had enabled Morrison's behavior were addressed through new policies, improved training, and cultural changes that emphasized accountability at all levels of command. Captain Morrison had thought he was teaching Lieutenant Sarah Chen a lesson about respect and military hierarchy. Instead, he became the subject of a lesson that would be taught to military personnel for generations about the consequences of abusing authority and the importance of protecting those who serve. Morrison learned the hardest lesson of all, that rank without honor is meaningless, that authority without accountability is dangerous, and that threatening someone who has dedicated their life to protecting others is a mistake you only get to make once. The woman he had tried to intimidate had not only ended his career, but had used his own actions to create lasting changes that would protect countless others from similar abuse. In the end, Morrison's greatest legacy was not his 20 years of military service, but the reforms his misconduct made necessary, and the precedent his conviction established. Sarah Chen had accomplished something that went far beyond personal justice. She had demonstrated that the military justice system could work, that abusive leaders could be held accountable, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with patience, evidence, and unwavering commitment to doing what is right. The captain had learned why you never test a Navy SEAL, but the lesson extended far beyond one man's downfall. It became a reminder that in the military, as in life, true strength comes not from the ability to intimidate others, but from the courage to stand up for what is right, regardless of the personal cost.